Some nights I wish they just fall off, but I still wake up, I still see your ghost. Oh Lord, I'm still not sure what I stand for. Oh, what do I stand for? What do I stand for?
All right, well, we need to introduce everyone else, so I'll go ahead and do that now. Dr. Angelo Cordavilla, correct? Cordavilla, all right, is a professor of international relations at Boston University. He was a naval officer, a foreign service officer, and a staff member of the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Please welcome Dr. Cordavilla. Wave. Next, we want to welcome freshman Congressman Tom Cotton, who is a Harvard graduate and a Harvard Law School graduate. He was born and raised on his family's cattle farm in Yell County, Arkansas, and is a sixth-generation Arkansas native. And he now represents Arkansas's 4th District. Please welcome Tom Cotton. Next, Dr. Ivan Eland serves as a fellow at the Independent Institute. He has been the Director of Defense Policy Studies at the Cato Institute and spent 15 years working for Congress on national security issues. He has also served as an Evaluator-in-Chief for the U.S. General Accounting Office and has testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Government Reform on various matters. Please welcome Dr. Eland. And last but not least, Texas Congressman Louis Gohmert, who if you've seen some of the questions that Representative Gohmert asked on Capitol Hill, you appreciate his blunt words to many of the people who testified before him. He was first sworn into office in 2005. His district encompasses over 12 counties in Texas, and he serves on numerous House committees and subcommittees and was recently named Vice Chair of the Judiciary Committee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. Please welcome Representative Louis Gohmert.
Well, thank you very much. It's my privilege to open this panel and moderate the panel. And the question before us is a discussion about war and the United States engagement in war. And we have 4 expert panelists here today, and I'm interested in how their competing ideas might shake out here at the CPAC conference. It's a privilege to be back again, by the way. and I think back over American history when the topic of this forum came up. And sometimes I'll be engaged in debate in Congress, and someone will invariably say, from the other side of the aisle usually, that nothing good ever comes from war. Now, just think about that a split second, and then I go back to the Revolutionary War. What came from that was good? Well, the United States of America was a pretty good result of that Revolutionary War. And as brutal as it was, our most brutal war of all put an end to slavery. That would be the Civil War. Then, we were a nation that was forming itself on this North American continent. We didn't have much for a look overseas. We didn't think of ourselves as an international force, and we were not at the conclusion of the Civil War. But in 1898, the USS Maine was sunk in Havana Harbor, and we found ourselves in the Spanish-American War. And that takes me forward 100 years from 1898, 100-plus years, as I sat in a hotel in Washington, D.C., and listened to the president of the Philippines, President Arroyo, give a speech to a little crowd in a hotel, and she said, "Thank you, America. Thank you for sending the United States Marines to our islands in 1898. She forgot about the Army. We will not forget about the Army, Mr. Cotton. But she forgot about the Army. But she said, "Thank you for sending your Marines. Thank you for liberating our islands. Thank you for teaching us the American way of life and free enterprise. Thank you for sending your priests, your pastors, and thank you for sending us 10,000 teachers, all of whom added to the Filipino culture. And today, 1.4 million Filipinos travel wherever in the world they want to go. They speak English, they understand free enterprise, they understand individualism in work, and it's a certain GDP, percentage of the GDP of the Philippines." Now, I bring that up because wherever Americans have gone around the world, we've carried our culture and our vision and our God-given liberty with us. And that's been a good thing when you look back at on balance. There's another side of this argument that you might hear. And I brought this book along. I've had it in my collection for some time. This is not very many of these sitting around Capitol Hill. The title of the book is How We Won the War by General Vo Nguyen Giap, who was given the credit for the strategist and leading the North Vietnamese in the Vietnam War. And I read through this book. I don't recommend you read it. It's not a very good book, but you'll find on page 6 some lines in there that say he got his first inspiration on how to defeat the United States because we accepted a negotiated settlement in Korea. And he believed we didn't have the will to finish. So that, I think, sets the stage for the discussion we're about to have, and I'm looking forward to it very much, as I know you are. And I'd like to introduce the first panelist to the podium, Dr. Coda Villa.
Title of the panel is Too Many Wars? Are we fighting too many wars? That's not a very good title. All human action, wars included, is to be judged by what it achieves, not by what goes into it. Suppose you were looking at a bunch of plumbers working on a house. You wouldn't ask how often do they show up or how much work are they putting in. You'd be asking when and whether can you flush the toilets. Now, when you look at a farmer plowing and weeding, you don't ask how much plowing and weeding he's doing. You ask, is he growing good food at reasonable prices? Plato taught us to consider shoemakers. Do they make good shoes? That is the purpose of shoemaking. Well, what is the purpose of those who deal with war and peace? What is the product that they're supposed to turn out? I suggest to you that that product is peace. And that product is often achieved by fighting wars. Now, nobody in his right mind ever fights the war just to fight a war. They fight it for the same reason that farmers plow and weed and shoemakers cobble. That is to say, to achieve their proper natural end. The proper natural end of war is your peace, the peace according to you, the peace that you want. Victory is that achievement. And defeat is, in fact, letting the enemy achieve his version of peace. That's what war is all about. Now, our bipartisan leaders for the past generation have forgotten that fundamental truth. And so they have engaged us in a variety of enterprises around the world without really knowing what we should be after and what we are fighting for. And therefore, it should be no surprise that they have simply thrown effort at the problem, and they have deprived us of the proper product. This country has no peace right now, and the lack of peace is eating away at us. What I'm suggesting to you is that wars are by nature for winning or for losing, but to be concluded, and that one enters into a war properly only with a reasonable idea on how to finish the job. The very notion of Colin Powell's very notion of an exit strategy is complete nonsense. The strategy is the entering strategy, the strategy that will lead you to your proper conclusion. Without that, any and all military operations make no sense whatsoever. They are quite literally senseless. You have to start with an idea of what you are going to finish. Now, if you had here the wise men of the Obama and of the Bush administration, by the way, these people are not so different after all, they would say that what I'm telling you is unsophisticated, and that what they have been doing for the past generation is a kind of sophistication. I suggest to you that this is complete balderdash, that it is not sophistication to declare war on an abstract noun called terrorism and on no one in particular without any notion of how to end it, and to shoot people here and there without an idea of who ought to be shot in order to end it. Now, why have they not designated who it is who ought to be shot in order to end it? Well, because a lot of these people are folks that they would like to have as friends who think they are their friends, for example, the Saudis, or who they thought they had lines to they could somehow control, Saddam Hussein. But above all, it is because they do not recognize they do not want to recognize the size of the problem. That is why the U.S. government, the CIA at its head, tried to delimit the problem of terrorism to this thing called Al-Qaeda. What is this? Objectively speaking, it was nothing but about 200 Arabs who had taken refuge in Afghanistan. That is long since gone. But in fact, there is a very broad movement throughout the Muslim world that is troubling us. And it will continue to trouble us so long as they lack respect for the United States. The purpose of any and all operations, military and diplomatic, ought to be to regain that respect. That respect is easily lost and very, very difficult to regain. Now, it involves a heck of a lot more than drone strikes and absolutely a hell of a lot more than nation building. By the way, there is nothing that is more completely nonsensical than the notion that we can somehow build other nations. What was the very first nation-building project of the United States? I'll tell you what it was. It was the attempt to reconstruct the South after the Civil War. That turned into obviously corruption, and it poisoned relations between the two parts of the country for 100 years. I suggest to you that we ought to think of peace and war the way the founders thought of it. We ought to think of our international relations in that way, and that we ought to keep clearly in mind that the purpose of our international affairs is to allow us to live peacefully, and that when our peace is troubled, war ought to take place in a definitive manner which ends the problem. If you haven't won the peace, you should not, and if you have no idea of how to win the peace, you ought not to engage in war. And if you do engage in war, you had better have an idea of how you are going to end it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Codevilla. And I can only think of one Harvard lawyer that thereafter went off to war to become a soldier and then came back to be elected to the United States Congress, Congressman Tom Cotton.
Thank you, Steve, for that kind introduction. You know, I saw the invitation to this panel, and I have to say I was somewhat shocked to see that Steve King would be the moderator. I think that's the only time we'll ever see any version of the word moderate next to Steve's name. It's great to be here this morning. You know, the title for this panel asks 3 questions, and I just thought I'd try to answer those questions in order. First, though, I'd like to recognize Professor Codevilla, who has been a practitioner and a thinker on matters of warfare and diplomacy for many years and influenced my own thought. I can remember a time in Iraq at a small combat outpost in 2006 where I was a platoon leader. We didn't have running water, we didn't have regular electricity, we didn't have hot food, but what we did have was the Claremont Review of Books. And Professor Codevilla had written in that book, or in that magazine, as he often did, and I remember reading his work there, as I did in Afghanistan years later as well. So it's a great pleasure to be here with him. I found myself in both of those, in both battlefronts, Iraq and Afghanistan, because of what happened on September 11th. I was in law school that day. I was in my last year of law school when America was attacked. And I knew from that point that I wanted to go fight on the front lines. I finished school and repaid my loans, but then I left and I became an infantry officer to go fight. And I think that answers the first question. Are we fighting too many wars? And I would say no. We're fighting one war, and it's a war against radical Islamic jihad. It's not a war against terror alone. Terror is a technique or a tactic, as the professor said. It's a war against specific people, radical Islamic jihadists who are trying to use terror to defeat the United States. Iraq and Afghanistan, as much as we might see those as distinct, are just two battlefronts in that war. I happen to fight in both of them. There are many other places, though, where that war is being waged by smaller teams, sometimes as small as a 12-man Green Beret A-team, places like Yemen and Somalia, Libya, Mali. That war comes to our own shores, not just as it did on 9/11, but when individuals try to attack it, like the Fort Hood shooter, Major Nidal Hassan, or the underwear bomber, Umar Abdul Muttalib, or the Times Square bomber, Fazil Shahzad. This is a war that we have to engage in and a war that we have to win. I would say, since we're the heirs of Reagan, that I would paraphrase our aims here, as he said of the Cold War: we win and they lose. What does victory look like in this war? Well, it won't look like it did after World War II. There won't be ticker tape parades, but our enemies will be broken. Their ability to project power against American interests or Americans, whether they be in Manhattan or the Pentagon, or our consulates and embassies overseas, will be degraded, and their co-religionists will reject their radical theological aims. And it is a war, though, that has to be won, or it is a war that will be lost. Our president often says 10 years of war are ending. Wars are not movies. They do not end. They are won or they are lost. The quickest way, as Orwell said, to lose a war or to end a war is to lose it. And I don't intend to let that happen to America on my watch as long as I'm in Washington, D.C. The next question is, should we fight anywhere? I think the answer, based on my remarks, is obviously yes, we should fight anywhere, but we should not fight everywhere. John Quincy Adams famously said, "We are friends of liberty everywhere, but guardians only of our own." Now, he also authored the Monroe Doctrine, which committed us to the defense of the entire hemisphere. But in today's world, we have to recognize that we fight where our national interests are clearly at stake. But with modern technology, with modern communications, with modern travel means, our national interests can be at stake in the smallest valleys in Afghanistan, where radical Islamic jihadists are plotting just a small cabal, a few dozen, a few $100,000. They can strike us in New York, they can strike us in Washington with just a few aircraft, kill 3,000 Americans, and change so much of the way we lead our daily lives. We have to be prepared to fight against them, just like we have to be prepared to fight against, say, Iran, which doesn't currently have the means to deliver nuclear weapons to America, but it does have the means to deliver them to our allies and to our outposts around the region. And if they were to obtain nuclear weapons, their Sunni Arab neighbors would certainly seek them as well, which means they would go into the hands of Salafist and Wahhabi terrorist organizations, which would deliver them to our shores. And it's important, therefore, that we remember that we are fighting a war. We are not engaged in a law enforcement campaign. I worry that the president thinks we are. Just last week, we learned that we had apprehended in Jordan Osama bin Laden's son-in-law, a vicious propagandizer for al-Qaeda in the days after 9/11, a man who is an avowed and open member of al-Qaeda, who is filling the shoes of his father-in-law after that attack. What happened? Did we send him to Guantanamo Bay for interrogation and ultimately for a military trial? No. We read him his Miranda rights and we sent him to federal district court in New York City. Now, it's possible, I suppose, that we had exploited him for all intelligence value in just the few hours or days that we had him. Given that it took years of intelligence interrogations to learn from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and other men at Guantanamo Bay that the courier network was still active for Osama bin Laden and led us to his hiding place, I doubt that we actually fully exploited him for intelligence purposes. The president, I worry, is returning us to a law enforcement construct, the kind that prevailed in the 1990s before the 9/11 attacks. And speaking of the 1990s, the final question is, can we afford this war? The answer is yes, we can afford it, and the answer is we must afford it. We certainly have a staggering national debt. Our military is not responsible for that. As a historical average, a percent of both our economy and federal spending, it's still relatively low. It's projected to trend downward, much as it did in the 1970s and the 1990s. And that's why we must afford it. Because think of what happened in the 1970s. The Soviet Union was aggressively on the march around the world, in Afghanistan and Africa and Central America. Think of what happened in the 1990s as Al-Qaeda and their affiliates repeatedly struck us at the World Trade Center in 1993, Saudi Arabia in 1996, and the East African embassies in 1998, the U.S. Cole in 2000, ultimately on 9/11 in 2001. So we can afford it, and we must afford it. We have the national wealth to do so. We have the manpower to win the war. We have the material to win the war. The question is, do we have the most essential element of combat power? Do we have the will to win the war? Our enemies certainly have that will. They question now whether we do. I know that there's war weariness among the American people, just like there is war weariness among conservatives and in this audience, no doubt. It's little surprising that the American people are war weary when their commander-in-chief is the weariest of them all. But we are the heirs to Ronald Reagan, who believed in peace through strength. Not peace through conciliation, not peace through appeasement, not peace through retreat, but peace through strength. And if America is to fight and to win our wars, and if we are to lead the world, we as conservatives must have the will to win. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Cotton. And I'd like to now welcome to the podium Dr. Ivan Elan, who has Iowa State roots, born and raised in Iowa, an undergraduate work at Iowa State and George Washington University, but the current senior fellow and director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. Dr. Elan.
Thank you. Well, my perspective is a little bit different than Congressman Cotton's. I go back to what the founders intended, and it's very clear what they intended. The Constitution says provide for the common defense. It does not say provide for the common empire or provide for the common other country's defense. The founders hated militarism and wars of aggrandizement conducted by European monarchs at the expense of blood and treasure of their own people. And that's why America was founded. Now, America was to be different, and the founders, virtually all, were suspicious of standing armies. Now, they knew that the wars had many bad domestic consequences, and I think we've forgotten that in our thirst to go after Islamic radical Islam. And I don't think we should be fighting radical Islam. Radical Islam has existed for centuries. The question that we ought to be asking ourselves, we ought to be fighting the radical Islamists who are attacking the United States. We've hit everybody else, Iraq, we're now in Somalia and now in Mali. Are we making more enemies? We ought to ask ourselves that question. The founders also knew that the checks and balances were thrown out of whack when we go to war. Now, I'm not saying we should never go to war, but as Madison famously said, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. Yet continuous warfare is what we've had since World War II. With when we went away from the founders' original plan of avoiding alliances, staying out of other people's business, and we've had continuous war since World War II, and that's an aberration in U.S. history. And the government has ballooned both in security areas, which you would expect, but also, and the conservatives really have to get with this, the domestic spending always increases during war. Take an example of Reagan. He increased the military budget, but in keeping with that, he had to give Tip O'Neill huge increases in domestic spending. Ronald Reagan, contrary to popular belief, did not reduce the size of the government. The government, as a percentage of GDP, increased during Reagan's time. So the Reagan model may have been applicable during the Cold War, but I think instead of following Reagan, perhaps we should go back to Coolidge. Coolidge is my hero. He was a non-interventionist. He cut the government in half. And war, you know, we've spent $1.3 trillion in Afghanistan and Iraq. Where does this end? And I think we've gotten rid of the main al-Qaeda trunk. If somebody else is lurking like there's going to be an imminent attack, and that's what we really need to focus on, fine, take them out. I have no nostalgia for Islamic terrorists, but I think we can go around. The basic problem with government, both in the security realm and in the domestic realm, is they try to scare you, right? They're saying that there's risk and the government has to protect us. So we ought to evaluate those risks. We don't just say, well, you know, the president says it's time to go to war no matter what party the president is. But, and there's two main reasons to stay out of war if you're a conservative. The first one is many empires have fallen because they become overextended and couldn't afford their empires financially. For example, the British and French won 2 world wars and lost their empires. Now, the United States is overextended. We have 1/4 of the world's GDP, but we spend half the world's defense spending. So, and while China, India, and Brazil, and Turkey are not policing the world, what are they doing? They're competing with us economically. Our own allies compete with us economically. So, and we provide their security umbrella. Couldn't at least, if you don't want to go to the extreme anti-war position, couldn't our allies do more? Because they're certainly using those resources to compete with us economically. But yet we provide defense for rich countries against poor countries all around the world. Look at the Korean Peninsula, look at Europe, look at the Middle East. All of our allies are the rich countries. So couldn't they do a little bit more? Also, we have, and this is the key, the conservatives in the 1920s, Harding and Coolidge realized this, that there is a connection between the warfare and the welfare state. Conservatives blame FDR for the mess that we have now of big government, but they really should blame Woodrow Wilson, who conveniently is also a Democrat. But the roots of the New Deal were in the government takeover of the economy in World War I. It's the first time it ever happened. Didn't even happen in the Civil War. And FDR brought back all the people, all the programs from that, and the command type of structure. So if you really want to point to big government, we were talking about the Spanish-American War earlier. Well, the progressive movement got a big lift from the Spanish-American War, and also we got the estate tax from the Spanish-American War. What other things have we gotten from wars that are domestic? Well, in the Crimean War, and the British found that they could raise a lot of money with the income tax. Well, the North in the Civil War, they decided, hey, great idea. So they brought it into the U.S., and of course, over time, with the wars, the income tax has grown each time. That's where we got the income tax. It became the dominant form of U.S. taxation during World War I. In World War II, it went from the class tax to the mass tax, so everybody got taxed. And of course, then we had the pernicious withholding, so they don't even know what the government is taking from you. Just some other Civil War pensions. How would that relate to a domestic program? Try Social Security. So I already mentioned the Spanish-American War with the estate tax. World War I mentioned that the income tax replaced tariffs as the main source of federal revenue. And so we have all these programs which originate in warfare. So war has dramatic domestic consequences. And we haven't been really successful in implementing democracy at the point of a gun. It's been tried by the U.S. 15 times since 1900. It's succeeded 4 times. So what should we do? Perhaps we should be a little bit more careful about what we police overseas, and perhaps be more strategically independent. It's been said that, and a previous speaker said this, but it's common wisdom that we have communications, transportation, and now we have to be interested in everything. Well, the United States has the most intrinsically secure geopolitical position of any great power in history. We have 2 large moats, we have weak and friendly neighbors, and we have the most incredible nuclear arsenal on the planet, right? Now, if you stay out of stuff, you're going to have less terrorism, which is the main thing that we can't defend against, right? And so I think we really need to be careful about what we get involved in. And we can certainly fight the enemies that are attacking us, but I think we ought to do that. We fought everybody else. So I think we need to truly define our interests narrowly and focus on the ill that warfare, what it's done to our democracy here at home.
Thank you, Dr. Elin. Surely there could only have been two people that did this together out of the whole 6 billion people on the planet, and that would be to take our shoes off and roll our pants up and wade ashore together onto a free Cuba at Guantanamo Bay, and almost within the same year, climb a mountain in Tibet and plant an American flag. Congressman Louis Gohmert, 1st District of Texas.
Thank you. Well, it's terrific to be here, and the few of you that were hollering out, thank you. It means a lot. Last time I was here, it was a banquet, and there was a round tables. People were sitting out. One guy was sitting by himself. He had the glasses, just the look of somewhat liberal, but hey, I want to be friendly. Conservatives are friendly people. I walked up, put on my best smile, and said, "Are you sitting here alone?" And he said, "I sure hope so." So anyway, any kind of warmth at all is really appreciated, but thank you. Some good points have been made here. Now, I owed the Army 4 years from a scholarship at Texas A&M, and I served in the Army under Commander Jimmy Carter. How about that? Yes. Now, one of the things that we've heard over and over again since Vietnam is, you know, well, we don't want to get in another unwinnable war like Vietnam. I'm not going to debate the merits of whether we should or should not have gone to Vietnam, but what I will tell you is Vietnam was winnable, but people in Washington decided we would not win it. Now, you want to know if it was winnable? Read the end of Sam Johnson's book. POW in Hanoi Hilton for 7 years, the majority of that in isolation because they couldn't break his will. As he's leaving, if you know the history of what happened, you know, Nixon says we'll get out of it. They go to Paris, they have the peace talks. The North Vietnamese make a huge deal out of storming out. And then he carpet bombed North Vietnam and specifically Hanoi for 2 weeks. They rush back to the table and we surrender in effect. And then the POWs are being released. They've been through the worst kind of atrocities you could imagine. Sam said the meanest officer was laughing and said, "You stupid Americans, don't you know if you had bombed us for 1 more week, we would have had to surrender unconditionally?" Folks, when you hear people talk about the lesson of Vietnam, it ought to be this. You don't send American men or women to harm's way unless you're going to give them the authority and what they need to win and then bring them home. That's the lesson of Vietnam. And, you know, Jimmy Carter, I'm sorry, when our embassy was attacked, it was an act of war in 1979. And I really believed, and we were watching carefully from Fort Benning where I was stationed, and we expected, nobody really wanted to go, but we had been attacked. We expected the United States to respond. And we watched for 3 days where all we did was kind of beg them, well, just let our people go. And after 3 days, they quit saying the students have them and they started saying we have them because they saw we didn't have leadership with a will to defend America as oaths are taken to do. And I still believe today that we have Americans dying for their country because we did not send a message in 1979, you don't attack American soil, and that's what an embassy is. We should stand up. There is a time for war. There's a time for peace. But if you go to war, you better mean it. Now, in Afghanistan, people have forgotten because it's dragged on over there, but we won that war. We defeated the Taliban in less than 4 months. During Iraq, when it drug out, people were going, remember Afghanistan? That's the way you fight a war. How did we do that? Now, Steve and I have been over there. We've met with leaders from the Northern Alliance. Perhaps you remember the Northern Alliance. They fought the Taliban and defeated them for us. We had less than 500 American soldiers, special ops and intelligence in Afghanistan when we defeated the Taliban because the Northern Alliance did our work. And now when we meet with the Northern Alliance, this administration calls them war criminals. We shouldn't be meeting with war criminals. Yes, they're Muslim. They're our friends because the enemy of my enemy can be my friend. We gave them military support, some arms. We gave them aerial support. And the greatest battle was when General Dustin, that we've met, and I've met him a number of times, and I consider him a friend, but he's a legend. He led 1,000 horsemen uphill into the face of RPGs, bullets, artillery, and they overtook the Taliban stronghold, and that was the beginning of the very end for the Taliban until after we won, then we sent in tens of thousands of troops to start occupying. We don't do well, nobody does well occupying, and especially not there. Some have said, well, Louis Alexander the Great, he conquered that area. He died on the way out. I don't consider that too great of a win when you die leaving the place you thought you won. But anyway, there are ways to do this. And one of the most important things you do is you make sure the world knows that those who are your friends, they benefit from being your friends. But if you're our enemy, you do not benefit. You don't go to the Taliban and say, please, please come sit down with us and we'll buy you offices in Qatar and we'll release your murdering thugs from Guantanamo and other places. Just no preconditions, just sit down with us. General Dustin said, and he's a legend, he talks to people all over, he said, you would not believe the arrogance of the Pakistani leaders. They're saying, why are they offering to do all this for the Taliban? Don't they know we're supplying the Taliban? They ought to be coming begging us, we'll bribe you, we'll buy you stuff. Instead, they're not even treating us very nice. They send drones over. We ought to send them a lesson. We're the ones in charge of the Taliban. And we had met with the Baluch people. The Baluch Baluchistan is the biggest area of Pakistan. It's the southern area. Most of Pakistan's natural resources are there. Arbitrarily, lines were drawn after World War II, and most of Baluchistan's in Pakistan. The Pakistani government, military, they terrorize the people. They take their mineral resources, and they live off the Baluch people and keep them terrorized. After meeting with Baluch people and then meeting again with the Northern Alliance leaders, I said to Masood, Dustin, and some of the others, what do you think would happen if we started, just some of us in Washington, encouraging an independent Baluchistan? Some of their eyes got big. Dustin said through an interpreter, that would change everything. You would see the Pakistani arrogance dry up overnight. There are ways to deal with your enemies. You don't have to always go to war. And in fact, right after that, there was, within a week, in the largest newspaper in Pakistan, there was an op-ed in response to one that I did at Dana Rohrabacher, and I inserted one line that simply said, maybe it's time to start talking about an independent Baluchistan as a way to stop the supplying of the Taliban. And in this op-ed, they said, in another interesting development, Louis Gohmert, a U.S. Republican representative, proposed that in order to beat the Taliban, the U.S. should carve out a new friendly state of Baluchistan from within Pakistan to stabilize Afghanistan's western border. Even if Mr. Gohmert does not necessarily speak for Washington, John Boehner would tell you I don't speak for him. But anyway, it's logical to assume he made this observation after picking up the buzz in American political circles. And it goes on to say, well, I'm from Texas. I probably just want their mineral resources. But then they finish by saying, before this loud thinking is embraced as policy by Washington, for our own territorial integrity, maybe we should do away with our double game in the war on terror and politically settle Baluchistan's issues By helping the Afghan Taliban and other jihadi groups, we've only weakened our own country. And they say maybe they ought to be good to Baluch people and stop helping the Taliban. Folks, you don't have to pay people to hate you. They'll do it for free. Benefit your friends. Make sure your enemies suffer for being your enemies. You'll save going to war so often if you do that. But when you do, send all that you've got, win, and come home. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Louis. Sure glad we saved you for last, Louis. And our clock is ticking down, so I'd like to pose a question and go down the line of the panelists in this way. We've talked about war, the results of war. I would ask each of the panelists to consider this question about the trajectory of America's destiny. If we accept that we'd won every war up until the end of World War II, maybe I should inject into that about February 11th of 1945 in Yalta, when there was a negotiated settlement on how World War II would end and where the Iron Curtain would ultimately be and who would live in freedom and who would live in slavery, and how that may have, and I believe did, launch the Cold War that cost a lot more lives than we recognize and appreciate. 700 to 900 Americans lives would be lost just in training and exercises during the Cold War because we had a massive military. But America's trajectory of our destiny, because of the close of World War II, because of the negotiated settlement in Korea, because of the conclusion of the Vietnam War in the manner that Mr. Gohmert has spoken, and because of the indecisive conclusions of the wars we fought since then, how might our trajectory be different? How might America's destiny be different if we had concluded those with the resounding victories rather than negotiated settlements? Dr. Codevilla.
We started, by doing what you described, we started on the path which is taking us to the point where not just, well, where our establishment, right and left, generally agrees with the notion that the president ought to be able to kill American citizens on his own recognizance. That is the kind of inward turning that generally characterizes a defeated people. We began to accept defeat as a normal thing. And we developed a foreign policy establishment that is ignorant of the simple and beneficial truths that Louis Gohmert just described for us. He described perfectly well how even in this benighted time of ours, our military forces put our foreign policy establishment in the position to secure peace for the United States, but they did not. We invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein and put ourselves in a position to gain respect for the United States. Instead, we spoiled that by occupying the country, and we ended up with no one afraid of us, and we ourselves being afraid of ourselves. We, in Afghanistan, by helping the Northern Alliance to win in a minimal manner, we vanquished those few Afghans who were our enemies, because most Afghans didn't even know we exist. But we then spoiled it all by occupying the country, trying to tell them how to live, and we made thousands and thousands of enemies. So we have gone by going down the road that you've described. We've gone toward our current state of affairs, which is only going to get worse unless we turn around and embrace the simple and healthy truths that Louis Gohmert described for us, which, by the way, Machiavelli had done a few hundred years before.
That's true.
And they come down to this: never ever do your enemy a little bit of harm.
Thank you, Dr. Codevilla. Mr. Cotton?
Our tendency to end wars indecisively since World War II have made the world a more dangerous place and have made America's enemies fear us less and our allies doubt us more, as Louis pointed out in his remarks. You saw this on the front lines in Iraq and Afghanistan. Civilians who wanted to help you wanted to point out where roadside bombs had been emplaced or who emplaced them were afraid to, because they were afraid from what they saw in the news in 2006 in Iraq, for instance, that America was going to abandon them again. It's a common saying you hear on the front lines in Afghanistan of the Taliban, you have the watches, but we have the time, because they've seen this history over and over again of America's political leadership being too sophisticated, as you said earlier, and focusing on things like exit strategies as opposed to victory strategies.
Thank you. Dr. Elin?
Thank you. It's a good question. Is a good one. Although I think we always start history at World War II, and I think we ought to start history at World War I. It was the most important event of the 20th century, and if the United States hadn't gotten into World War I, if it had stayed out of it, and it wasn't really that strategic to be in it, we wouldn't have had the Russian Revolution, the Cold War, or Hitler. So I think the message here is, and it's really important now, because this fantasy that we're going to get in a war, we're going to win it, we're going to get out like World War II, that's the aberration in human history. Guerrilla warfare is so much more common, and guerrillas usually win over history. And so I think we have to be careful. The moral of the story is, yes, you may need to fight, but let's have a judicious assessment of that before we just go in like we did in Iraq as a classic example. And I think after Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, we've shown the people how to beat us. And it's been the same since the beginning of history. How do you beat a stronger team? And this vision that we're going to do this, go in, get out, it's gone. It's gone. And so we need to be very careful where we get in places, because we have a very powerful military that's very good at what it does, beating other states' militaries. But when you get into guerrillas and terrorists and that sort of thing, you really need to be careful. One final thought. We also need to remember that the economy is the basis of all other national power, including military power. So I don't propose a retrenchment. I propose a national rejuvenation, and that's what we really need to do. Think Calvin Coolidge.
Thank you, Dr. Elin. Mr. Gomer, as our clock runs out.
And I just agree with so much of what's been said. And I'm not advocating that we just think we're always going to jump in and defeat everybody in the country. I think we got on the wrong track further under the Carter administration when we started vilifying the idea of taking out leaders who declared war on us. And instead, we go to war with a whole country where most of the country likes us. And then, like you point out, by the time we're done, they don't like us. I think it's time to have a national dialogue. I'm not big on taking out Americans, and especially if they're on Capitol Hill leading Muslim prayers like Al-Awlaki was previously. But think about it. You know, I think maybe the way to go is when you have a person, a leader, or a government that declares war on us, take them out and say, look, you're into self-determination. You decide what government you want in this country. We're not going to get in your way. We're not going to dictate to you. But understand this. You pick another government like this that will declare war on the United States, we'll take them out too. So I think it's achievable if you don't have a goal of just going to war. Take out the people that are at war and leave the rest alone.
Thank you, Louis. First, I want to say to Dr. Elin, I'm going to rethink the America's involvement in the First World War. I had not gone back and reverse engineered history with that perspective, and I'm going to do that. That's an important point that I had not considered. I do consider, as I listen to our panelists, sitting in a hotel in Kuwait City waiting to go into Iraq the next day, and I remember the date, June 11th, 2004. And on Al Jazeera TV came the face of Muqtada al-Sadr, the leader of the Mahdi militia there, and he said, and I was reading the closed caption in English underneath, he said, if we continue attacking Americans, they will leave Iraq the same way they left Vietnam, the same way they left Lebanon, the same way they left Mogadishu. I could hear what that message was. He believed that Americans didn't have resolve and they could fight a war of attrition against us and we would lose our will here in the United States. So my message is this. I think out of this we can consistently, if we're going to go to war, we should do so reluctantly. We should do so with a clear objective, and we should be committed to define the victory before we enter into the war and pull the American people behind us with an eye to American destiny. We've got an obligation to history that goes beyond Ronald Reagan's shining city on the hill. Thank you all the panelists. It's been a great panel. I appreciate it. Thank you all very much.